Welcome to our virtual tour, Proclaiming a Republic. This exhibition at the National Museum of Ireland in Collins Barracks in Dublin tells the story of those who fought in the 1916 Easter Rising. It tells their stories through the objects, artefacts and personal effects that we have had on display here between 2016 and 2020. In this film, we focus on some lesser known and fascinating stories from the 1916 rebellion. Some of these stories might be about people you haven't heard of before. Their artefacts allow us to explore some of the key themes presented in the exhibition. In particular, we explore the theme of choice, and we look at what motivated those involved at the time of the Rising to act as they did. We hope this virtual tour will give you a greater understanding of the complexities of this pivotal period in Irish history.
The Proclaiming a Republic, the 1916 Rising exhibition at the National Museum of Ireland, which opened in March of 2016 and ran until ultimately June of 2020, is the largest exhibition on the topic of the 1916 Rising and the Easter week collection of the National Museum in our history. It consists of hundreds of objects out of the 15,000 from the collection.
Well, the exhibition is obviously an exhibition about the 1916 Rising, but behind that, the theme is the National Museum's 8th iteration of this major 1916 exhibition. It gave the museum a chance to highlight its very, very important Easter week collection, and also to have some items out on display that had never been on display before.
Well, the Easter week collection actually began almost immediately after the Rising itself, when a Irish volunteers uniform was deposited into the museum that had been found at Jacob's factory. That was in 1917, and there had been another couple of examples of acquisitions as well. It wasn't until 1932 with Nellie Gifford Donnelly that the museum really were put under pressure to actually collect this event, and it was down to Nellie that this happened.
I think what Proclaiming a Republic does really well is it brings together lots of different facets of research of a particular time. It brings personal stories, and so you get this multi-layered perspective of a particular moment in time that's very, very important to the Irish people. And objects are very powerful in that regard, because sometimes they hold for an audience member the emotions of a particular moment in time. So when you look at a letter, you can imagine the person writing that letter. You can put yourself into that space, and that object brings you on a journey of that individual.
So in the exhibition, we actually look at the history from a lot of different angles. So we're looking at it from the women's perspective, from civilians' perspective, from the perspective of what happened to children. We were very interested in talking about the experience of the English soldier as well as the Irish soldier. So we really do try to bring out all of those nuances and those grey areas of history that you can pick on one object in the exhibition and really deep dive into the history of that object and what it really talks about.
I hope when people leave, having seen the exhibition, that they go away with a sense of the lesser-known figures from the Rising, and also a sense of what people sacrificed at the time during the Rising.
At 11:50 a.m. on Easter Monday, 150 rebels arrived here in Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street, and rushed the GPO, taking over the building. At 12:45, Patrick Pearse came outside and, dressed in the green uniform of the Irish Volunteers, read the Proclamation of the Irish Republic. Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
Overnight on Easter Sunday in 1916 in Liberty Hall, Dublin, the Proclamation of Independence was printed. This document, to be read on the first day of the rebellion, declared an Irish Republic, completely independent from Britain. Significantly, it was written for both Irish men and Irish women, and included a declaration of equal rights and civil liberties. The names of the proclamation's 7 signatories, Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, Tomás MacDonagh, Thomas Clark, Eamon Ceannt, Sean McDermott and Joseph Plunkett, are well known across Ireland. But what other people's stories can be told by this artefact? For most people who think of the 1916 Rising, they think of the Proclamation. And this particular document belonged to Dr. Kathleen Lynn, and she was the Chief Medical Officer of the Irish Citizens' Army during the rebellion.
What I like to talk about first about the Proclamation is actually the part that you can't see, right? And that's on the back, Kathleen Lynn and 10 other women who were imprisoned in Mountjoy after the Rising chose to sign this document and kind of mark themselves in history and associate themselves very clearly and directly with what is written in the Proclamation. And I think that's really important. They knew that this was going to be maybe in a museum one day, or at least talked about one day, and they wanted to be associated with it.
It's also signed by the 2 compositors and the printer. The text had been given to Christopher Brady by Tomás MacDonagh on the Saturday, and then over 24 hours, 2,500 of these documents were printed.
Yeah, and they had to get these out really quickly and secretly. And so what we find with the document are some of the ways that we can tell it's an original. The errors, the anomalies, the quick fixes that they had to make. When I give this tour in person, I love to kind of talk about the mistakes and see what we can point out. Certainly, you know, this wouldn't have been typed up or anything like that. It would have been individual letters laid out in a press. And so that's where we see these anomalies, is in not having enough lettering, in rushing the lettering and not having time to go back and scan it. And so we see the lettering behind you there that they would have laid out individually into the press to then make this document.
So these would have been highly trained compositors and printers. They would have served apprentices for 7 years, and it was highly unlikely that they would have made mistakes like this. And it really shows the pressure they were under to get this seditious document out.
When we look at the line that says Irish Republic, the C was an O, and so they would have put perhaps a bit of sealant wax over it so that the O would have become a C. Also, in the word the, you're going to see kind of a different tail on the end of that E, and so that likely was an F that they had to add a bit.
And you can see that the document was actually signed by the 7 signatories, and they knew that when their names would appear on this document, that they were signing their own death warrants. This was treason. It was a seditious document, and they knew that they would be making a blood sacrifice for the Irish Republic and for the people of Ireland.
Yeah. And we know these names and we learn about them a bit further in the exhibition, but you also have then some names that maybe aren't as common, and that represents the ordinary people who would have chosen to participate in this rebellion and how they chose to do so in their own ways, that this wasn't just 7 men who decided to start a rebellion, but that it was ordinary people fighting for what they wanted, this free and independent Ireland.
We went back to the background, trying to explain why an Ireland that was outwardly peaceful, probably the most peaceful it had been in centuries, in the early 20th century, suddenly went to outright war.
What we really wanted to focus on what the motivations were for people to have participated in this event. So you have a lot of different groups coming from a lot of different ideologies and philosophies.
How did an Ireland which was outwardly at peace in 1900 come to rebellion in 1916? In 1913, 2 armies had formed in Ireland. The Ulster Volunteer Force was formed to stop Home Rule, which would give Ireland a level of independence from Britain. This had been promised by the British government to come into law by 1914. The Irish Volunteers were formed as a response to the Ulster Volunteers. But why had these 2 groups been necessary, and who was joining them?
2 of the objects that we have here represent the two traditions, nationalism and unionism, that would have been prevalent in the years before the 1916 Rising. One of them is an orange order collarette, has a number of iconic images on it. LOL, which stands for Loyal Orange Lodge, might mean something different in modern terms. Some of the other images there represent images from the Old Testament, which are important in the Protestant religion, the Protestant tradition.
We have this walking stick here, which would have come from the nationalist tradition, people who would have primarily looked at Ireland and said, we want to give Ireland some form of independence from Britain. So you can see engraved on the stick the names of several key Irish nationalist leaders, and also you can see like shamrocks all along it, and you can see other kind of important Celtic images. And these would have been used, say, when Irish nationalists went on, say, marches as a way of showing off their side in this sort of political debate.
They would have been people who supported the tradition of Charles Stewart Parnell, and under Redmond and John Dillon were constitutional nationalists, quite different from those who came out and fought in 1916.
And what about, say, for young children? Would they even have joined these groups as well, or would there have been an equivalent for them?
There would have been equivalents, but they would have been like things like the Boys Brigade in Ulster, and you have the Fianna Éireann Boy Scouts, which is a nationalist scouting organisation in the rest of Ireland, which was founded in 1909 by Countess Markovic and Bulmer Hobson.
And within groups like these, where these kids would have learned, say, Irish traditions like Irish dancing, the Irish language, but they also would have been militarised, would have been taught how to use weapons, to bring weapons around the country. And actually here in the National Museum, we have the uniform of a boy called John Kelly, who would have been 10 years old, wearing his uniform when he fought in the 1916 Rising down at the Four Courts. For these kids, these decisions would have been based on, what politics their parents had, what neighbourhoods they came from. They didn't necessarily get to choose themselves what areas they would go to.
Not necessarily, but you have to remember as well that Ireland was very militarised at this period. So when you're at the age of about 10, 11, 12, like John Kelly was, age 10 when he fought in the Rising, it wasn't unusual to be involved in those type of organisations.
So we have these two traditions now at this time. We've got the Unionists and the Nationalists. So the question is, how does this lead us to the 1916 Rising? And indeed, are these groups even involved in the Rising in the first place?
Well, when the war broke out, Ireland was probably on the verge of civil war. You had the Ulster Volunteer Force who were drilling and arming themselves in Ulster, and you had the Irish Volunteers in the rest of the country. When the war broke out, Carson called on the Ulster Volunteers to fight with the British forces in Europe, as did John Redmond.
He was asking the Irish Volunteers. Obviously.
The Irish Volunteers. And the Irish Volunteers split between those who didn't want to support the British war effort and those who did. Around 11,000 followed Eoin MacNeill and remained as the Irish Volunteers. And it's that group that formed the core of those that came out and fought in 1916.
They're the ones that the IRB, people like say Patrick Pearse and Thomas Clark are looking and saying we can use them for this rebellion. So then we see by Easter 1916, we see that small group being led by Patrick Pearse. We see a small army called the Irish Citizens Army, led by a Scottish man called James Connolly, and about 300 women from Cumann going out, taking over key buildings around the city here in Dublin, and beginning the 1916 Easter Rising. So in the week leading up to the 1916 Rising, we're seeing obviously the plans become more concrete and more people being told about the rebellion. And one person who's only now beginning to be told about is actually this man here, Eoin MacNeill, who is the leader of the Irish Volunteers, who the rebels have to basically bring on side so he'll let the volunteers fight. Now 2 days before the Rising begins, he hears about the sinking of the Ode.
Well, he had been convinced on Thursday night to lend his support to the Rising, because there were guns coming from Germany with Roger Casement. Casement was captured on Bannistrand in County Kerry on Good Friday, together with the Ode, which was scuttled in Cork Harbour by its captain after it had been intercepted by the Royal Navy. He decided then to stop all manoeuvres and stop the Rising.
And of course it's that which must lead to him putting his famous countermando letter in the Irish newspapers, which says volunteers completely deceived, all orders for tomorrow Sunday are entirely cancelled, which actually have the original copy of here in this case.
And that was carried to volunteer companies all around the country, Those that were trying to organise the rising then had a decision to make whether they try and go ahead on Sunday or they postpone it by 24 hours. They postponed it by 24 hours and came out on Easter Monday.
So this one we have here, this is the proper original letter McNeill would have written, is that correct?
This is one of the orders that would have went throughout the country. Now we know this one was given to us in the 1930s by Annie O'Rahilly, who was related to the O'Rahilly who fought.
Because presumably for the volunteers all around the country, I mean, because this is before, you know, text messages or anything like that. So actually to get your message out is so much harder. It must have caused such confusion for them seeing this note and then hearing all these other messages coming around by different members of the Irish Volunteers.
It did. It caused tremendous confusion. And instead of the 10 or 11,000 Irish volunteers and Irish Citizen Army that were expected to mobilise, only about 1,600 actually mobilised on Monday in Dublin.
So earlier on we were talking about how the proclamation itself was actually made and so the plans to make the proclamation. As we're saying, actually this table here, this is where the rebels would have actually laid out the original proof of the actual text itself.
And it's probably the table where they would have met on Easter Monday morning, possibly had their final breakfast before the rebellion.
What do you think their mood would have been like, and the mood sort of in the building in general between the men and women?
You had a lot of people running around. You had very few people who knew exactly what was happening. James Connolly answered a question from William O'Brien, and he said, "We are going out to be slaughtered." And O'Brien said, "Is there any chance of success?" And he said, "No, none whatsoever."
As we're saying that all the artefacts we have here in the National Museum, they are all real and authentic from our Easter Week collection itself. And this table would have come from Liberty Hall. We can actually see written in chalk the words Liberty Hall 1916.
Well, that handwriting is from Nellie Gifford Donnelly, who was a member of the Irish Citizen Army. She fought in the 1916 Rising. She was a sister of Grace Gifford, who married Joseph Murray Plunkett the night before he was executed. But Nellie Gifford Donnelly herself was the first secretary of the 1916-21 Club and put together the first collection of memorabilia and artefacts from the 1916 Rising. The next part of the exhibition deals with the rebel garrisons and where they were located in Easter week in 1916. On Easter Monday, the rebels occupied a number of key buildings around the city. In addition to the headquarters garrison in the General Post Office, there were 6 other garrisons in the city. We are going to have a look at some of the objects associated with those garrisons now. The rebels in Dublin were divided across the city. There were 4 battalions of the Irish Volunteers based in the areas around the Four Courts, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, Boland's Mill and the South Dublin Union. The Irish Citizen Army sent men and women to St Stephen's Green and to Dublin Castle. 5 of the 7 signatories, as well as initially 150 rebels, took over the GPO on Sackville Street.
The first garrison we look at is behind me here at Stephen's Green. At 11:40 a.m. on Easter Monday, approximately 40 rebels took over the green. They cleared it of civilians, built barricades, and dug defensive trenches. Now at about 4 a.m. on the second day of fighting, the British troops took over the Shelburne Hotel here behind me. Machine gunners took to the roof and opened fire, forcing the rebels to evacuate from the green to the Royal College of Surgeons. As the rebels came under heavy fire, they dashed from Stephen's Green to the Royal College of Surgeons behind me here. You can still today see the bullet holes from the machine gunners. The rebels entered through the side door, barricaded themselves inside, eventually surrendering at the end of the week.
At this part of the exhibition, we talk about the role of Countess Markovic during the actual week of 1916. And she finds her way to St Stephen's Green with Michael Mallon, and she is under his command. She's second in command, in fact, as part of the Irish Citizen Army.
Countess Markovic would have been using this wristwatch to time messages going to the GPO and other places to kind of keep up. And that lets us know a bit more about the role that women could have played in it.
This bandolier is actually Countess Markovic's, and also the Sambran belt as well, which she would have worn as part of her uniform. You can actually see an Irish citizen's uniform or a tunic behind there. Very few people could afford a full uniform. They had to pay for them by instalments, but because Countess Markovic was wealthy enough, she could actually completely tog out in her full uniform. We have a bandolier here, which is part of the handling objects here in the museum, but you can feel the weight of it, and it's made of leather, and it would have held her ammunition for her firearm, and she would have worn it across her body like that. And you can see in the picture behind, the men are actually wearing that bandolier, and it's the most common thing that they can afford to have, but they're trying to unify themselves. Very important to have a uniform in the time of a rising, because you have to know which side you're fighting on.
Countess Markovic, she would have been, as you said, second in command to Malin, sending these messages out. But we also know about her that she would have allowed for her home to be used for Nafina Erin. We know that she would later go on to be one of the 77 women arrested. She was the one who, because of her role in organizing it, was sentenced to execution. That was later stayed to life in prison. We know she didn't serve the rest of her life in prison. In fact, we know she went on to be the first woman elected to the British Parliament. And per Sinn Féin policy at the time, she did not take that seat in protest.
And of course there were other women involved in 1916 in the roles of gun smugglers and arms smugglers, but you had Elizabeth O'Farrell, of course, who was a nurse stationed at the GPO. You had Julia Grennan.
Yeah, and when we're looking at the various roles that people played, it wasn't just men, it wasn't just women, there were also children. And so we look at somebody like Charles Darcy and the role that he played as a child in 1916.
The bearer Charles Darcy has attended at the above schools. I have much pleasure in bearing testimony to his good character and shall always be pleased to hear of his success in life.
As we continue learning about the children who participated in 1916 in the Rising, we come here to Charles Darcy, who would have been aged 15 when the rebellion started. He was part of the group that was charged with taking Dublin Castle, and in fact he was killed that first night, that first day, on top of the Henry and James Clothier's shop, and lost his life for this cause. And it's through these artifacts that we're able to remember him. We learn from his objects about his life and the family who remembered him. We see the 1916 medal, we see a letter of recommendation from a headmaster saying that he was punctual, attentive, comes highly recommended, and was really a star pupil, and one who left an impression. And I think that kind of speaks to the quality of character of this boy.
But why would a boy that age need a recommendation letter?
Great question. So when we think of a 15-year-old, we think of somebody who's still in school. But at the age of 15, Charles Darcy would have been working in the Pym's department store, and this would have been pretty common. He would have finished up school around the age of 12, 13, and would have gone into work and would have been doing things that adults that we think of nowadays would be doing, and kind of earning money for himself and for his family.
Young children that age in general, I mean, it is a sense that they're one of these voices in the 1916 Rising, which maybe up until recently we didn't hear that much about. Yeah. You know, and like in this exhibition, we're looking at ordinary stories for people during the rebellion. And another boy actually who would be the same age as Charles Darcy was a boy called Sean Healy. He gets hit by a bullet and he doesn't survive the rebellion. And very famously, his last words were, "God bless the volunteers." And we're actually very lucky we have his hat here in the museum. There's a poignancy as well to artifacts like these, because given it was by Charles Darcy's family, so this would have been their way of remembering him.
Whenever I'm asked about what motivates people to give to the National Museum or any other museum that collects this event, I always think of Elizabeth Darcy. Elizabeth kept those objects with her right up until 1970, when she decided to donate that to the National Museum. In many ways, they have cared for those objects in place of that person for many, many years. And now they're at a point where they're handing over that responsibility to the state to take over that commemoration and remembrance instead.
Before the Rising, there were many attempts to smuggle arms into the country, and this boat, the Asgard, was used to smuggle 900 Mauser rifles and 29,000 rounds of ammunition into Dublin at Howth in 1914. Whilst the Mauser may not have been the most advanced weapon of its time, it did prove very effective when used by the rebels in the Mount Street Bridge area. Here we have a display case which has a number of the weapons that were used during Easter week. We have pistols, revolvers, homemade bayonets, one that was made from a garden shears, and we have homemade bombs which were made from cocoa tins. The Mauser rifles that were used by the rebels in the area around Mount Street were not as effective as the Lee Enfield rifle that was standard issue in the British Army. It had a clip of 5 or 10 bullets, so it had a high repeat rate. The Mauser, by comparison, had a single bullet which was bolt action. It could fire maybe 5 a minute compared to about 15 a minute for the Lee Enfield. However, because it had a long barrel, it was quite accurate and very, very effective as a sniper's rifle. On Wednesday morning, British infantry reinforcements arrived at Kingstown Harbour or Dundee. They marched into the city from the southern approaches and were ambushed at Mount Street Bridge by an outpost of the Boland's Mill garrison. They were using Mauser rifles that had been landed at Howth 2 years before. Because of its effectiveness as a sniper's rifle, British casualties were in excess of 230 killed and injured. There are a couple of personal stories associated with the Battle of Mount Street Bridge. One of them involves Captain Frederick Dietrichson with the Sherwood Foresters. He was married to Beatrice Mitchell of the wine merchanting family in Dublin. She and her 3 children had come home to Dublin to avoid Zeppelin raids during the First World War, and she came out to see the troops coming into Dublin, and little did she know that she would see her husband on the day. She hugged him, he went off to fight and was killed later in that evening. One of the rebels was Michael Malone, a lieutenant in the Irish Volunteers. He was killed at the Battle of Mount Street Bridge, a year after his brother, William Malone, had been killed in the British Army at the Battle of Ypres. These personal stories illustrate some of the complexities and confusion that existed around the 1916 Easter Rising for the people that were involved. After MacNeill's countermanding order, there was considerable confusion. In Limerick, in Cork City and in Dungannon, there were mobilisations of men who ended up being sent home again. There was a mobilisation in Enniscorthy, but they didn't see any fighting. In fact, it was Tuesday after all the other garrisons had surrendered that they actually surrendered in Enniscorthy. In Galway, 700 men mobilised, attacked RIC stations at Clarenbridge and Oranmore, and then surrendered. One of the more exciting and dramatic episodes after the Rising involves the escape of Liam Mellows, one of the leaders in Galway, who escaped after being on the run for about 5 months, dressed as a nun, wearing this veil here.
Mellows had led the uprising in Galway, and it had been somewhat successful until it was all called off. And he had spent about 5 months in hiding in the Clare Mountains until the point he was asked to go to America to begin fundraising. And this was the veil that was used to disguise him, to get him out of Ireland. You have to take a step back and ask yourself, well, how true can this be? It did actually take about 2 years of research to find that the story attached to Liam Mellows' nun veil was actually true, and that was the reason that we could include it in the exhibition.
The
The thing I remember most clearly about its hoisting is that I had some kind of hazy idea that the flag should be rolled up in some kind of ball so that when it would be hauled up, it would break out. As a matter of fact, I did it that way because it did open out in the proper manner when hoisted. The flag was floating on Princess Street corner of the GPO.
So during Easter week, one of the most common things you would have seen all around the centre of Dublin were all these new flags being flown in all different garrison locations by the rebels. This one here is possibly one of the most famous, the Irish Republic flag, which was hoisted over the GPO by Eamon Bulfin on the first day of the Rising in 1916. I think lots of the rebels would speak about, say, this flag and the tricolour flying up the GPO, and that being a real symbolic moment for the rebellion. I mean, there's many first-hand accounts we see of people who say that it's actually when they see flags like the Irish Republic flag here or the tricolour flying over the GPO is when they feel like they're actually fighting for something.
And as well as signifying patriotism, it also identifies garrisons and places, and they chose to fly these flags here that you see throughout the exhibition. And a note would have went out to the leaders of those garrisons with instructions on how to make these flags. And these flags would have been handmade, and you can actually see that because there are inconsistencies in how the flags are designed and shown. But there are definite colours involved, so you have a green ground, and you also have the iconic harp, which really identifies Irish people and how they identify as being Irish as well. And we also have the plough and the stars, which was the flag of the Irish Citizens' Army, and that was in fact made by the Doneamer Guild.
And you can see by the state that the flags are in how much damage is being done to the GPO itself. And it's actually very well captured in this particular painting here called The Birth of the Republic by Walter Paget. And it shows you the sort of the chaos inside the building. You can see in the corner here, you can see the fires at the windows. You can see the roof collapsing here in the centre. It's worth saying with this particular flag here, the Republic flag, is that you can see while it comes from 1916, it's seen a huge amount of damage in its time as well. And part of it comes from, if you look, you can see those bullet holes all along top of the flag, all along here. And you can see this corner here where it would have been torn off as bits of souvenirs, because when the rebellion comes to an end, this flag is captured by the British troops. And there's a very famous photograph on the top of Parnell Street with the troops standing with this flag. The flag itself is upside down, which is a sign of sort of disrespect for it. Whereas unfortunately the other flag, the Irish tricolour, actually falls into the building during Easter week. And it's only a couple of very small fragments actually remain of it. And you can see in the destruction of that moment why the rebels realised they had to leave the GPO and why they had to evacuate, and how the Rising slowly beginning to come to an end.
So by Friday, the GPO was in flames and collapsing in on itself. The rebels decided to evacuate to this house, number 16 Moore Street. Patrick Pearse looked out one of the windows and saw civilians machine gunned down, even though they were carrying a white flag. Without hope of success or escape, the rebels decided to call for a ceasefire and surrender. Elizabeth O'Farrell emerged from here with a white handkerchief and walked towards Great Britain Street, at this end of the street, towards the British troops carrying this handkerchief white flag, and asked for a ceasefire.
So here we're looking at some of the final surrender notes from the end of the 1916 Rising. You can see this one here is a handwritten note by Pearse, which he would have written at the end of the rebellion. And also this one here, this is a typed version. You can see Pearse has signed it as well. But you also see it signed by James Connolly and Thomas MacDonagh. So 3 of the 7 signatories would have signed this document right here. And this one was given to a woman called Elizabeth O'Farrell.
It's only recently that Elizabeth has become recognised as a huge part of that surrender moment in 1916. She was photographed beside Pearse at the time of surrender. And she was an amazing woman. She was actually a nurse, and she was stationed at the GPO during the Rising. And she was chosen to deliver these surrender notes throughout Dublin between all the different garrisons. She was one of 3 women left in the GPO. And one was Winifred Carney, who was the secretary to James Connolly, and she was devastated that James had been injured in the way that he was. And you had Julia Grennan as well, and they remained behind to care for the sick and the wounded at the GPO. So Elizabeth O'Farrell then was chosen to deliver these surrender notes. She would have been fired on both by the British and by the rebels. She would carry a white flag from garrison to garrison. She was very lucky she wasn't shot and killed during that movement.
Absolutely, and it's worth saying as well that when she brings the note to the different garrisons, because you've got groups like the Irish Volunteers, Irish Citizens Army, they're being led by different people. So very famously, the Irish Citizens Army say that we won't surrender unless we get a note signed by James Connolly. So one thing she has to do, she has to take this note here and to bring it to Dublin Castle Hospital where James Connolly is after he gets injured in the GPO, and to get him to sign this note right here, telling the Citizens Army members that they have to surrender as well. For the people living in Dublin at this time, I mean, when the rebels are leaving their locations, they're being met with this incredible anger by many people, you know, because the city has been destroyed. Unfortunately, in the Rising, the highest casualties are civilians who, you know, aren't planning to go out and die for Ireland.
Yeah, the Dubliners were very opposed to the Rising. They didn't understand it, particularly the women who had their menfolk away at the front. It was, of course, in the middle of World War I, and they were expecting payments which were distributed through the GPO, and they didn't get their payments that week, and they were very upset, of course.
They see as essentially as an act of treason, and it's that idea of treason which is it plays such a key role in the British response at the end of this rebellion. After the Rising, we see 16 men executed, 14 here in Dublin, including the 7 signatories, between the 3rd and 12th of May 1916 in Kilmainham Jail. Their bodies are brought here to Arbour Hill and their possessions are returned to their families. The memorial in Arbour Hill now stands as a final resting place for the men. Thomas Kent is also executed in Cork, and a few months later Roger Casement was executed over in London. This space in the exhibition, this is where we focus on the executions. And obviously it's quite a sad location, so we don't necessarily bring tour groups in. Instead, we would let them sort of come in on their own and actually explore the area. So in the cases all along here, you see the final artifacts for the executed men. So these are the pieces they would have had with them, which were then given back to their families after the executions.
The leaders were tried under field court-martial because Britain was still at war with Germany, and as such they were traitors. And when they were executed, their bodies were not returned to their families, so there was no funerals. And that left a gap in the grieving process. And what became very, very important then were objects that they had in their last hours and their last days. One of the objects here, which is a very, very ordinary object, which stands out for me, is Eamon Cant's shoes. We all have shoes, they're very, very personal to us. He had them in a case with him when he fought in the South Dublin Union. He also had his uilleann pipes with him.
We have this shirt here, which is worn by James Connolly during the rebellion. And if you look on the arm, you can see a blood stain on it, because during Easter week, he leaves the building, the GPO, a couple of times. And one time he gets a bullet to the arm, one time he gets a bullet to the leg. So you can see the blood stain here from the injury he gets to his arm. But the leg, his shooting of the leg also is very important because basically he can't actually stand for the execution itself. So he ends up being tied to a chair, and that evokes incredible anger among many people in Ireland.
Initially, public support was against the rebels, but because of the nature of how the executions took place, starting on the 3rd of May and continuing with 2, 3, 4 rebels over a number of days, almost one by one until the 12th of May, it was deemed as a very, very harsh treatment of the rebels.
As well as the executions, we also see about 3,500 people being arrested, obviously, majority of whom wouldn't have been involved in the 1916 Rising, and mainly being sent off to prison camps like, say, Frangoc over in Wales. It's that severe British response, both the executions and the arrests, that begins to swing public opinion to supporting this idea of an independent Ireland.
We had a lot of discussion about the arrangement of the names on the Wall of the Dead. We made a decision that we would go with not segregating people out as to whether they were combatant, whether they were rebel, whether they were British Army, or whether they were civilian dead. It was, in some senses, it was different, but we felt that everybody deserved equal billing in death.
In addition to the rebels that were court-martialed, imprisoned and sent to England, there were some 3,000 men who were interned in a detention camp in Frangoc near Bala in North Wales. Whilst they were there, the men used the time to reorganise. Michael Collins and William T. Cosgrave were among the prisoners, and it's no wonder that it became known as Ullskull na Raibh Loide, or the University of Revolution. The men were involved in political meetings and in arts and crafts and sport and games. They got a rugby ball and they blew it out of shape and used it as a Gaelic football. And one of the fields nearby was nicknamed by the prisoners as Croke Park. They also would have made arts and crafts, and they made a monstrance here made out of the shoulder bone of a cow. But there was also everyday items like forks and cups that men took home with them as mementos or souvenirs of the time that they spent in Frangoc. The importance of some of these everyday objects in the memories of those who were involved in 1916 has given the museum a collection which is in excess of 15,000 objects. And we only have about 300 on display in this exhibition. But the importance of all of these objects and artefacts is that each one of them has a story to tell of the people who were there.
In our short time on this virtual tour of this exhibition, we have learnt about the experiences of those caught up in the rebellion, be they rebels, British soldiers or civilians. We have also explored the theme of choice, including the perspectives of those who chose to fight and those who chose not to, and the decision of the British to proceed with executions after the rebellion. We have seen how important artefacts can be in revealing the past, and how even the most everyday objects have the power to tell unique stories, enhancing our understanding of history. Thank you very much for joining us on the virtual tour of the exhibition Proclaiming a Republic here at Collins Barracks in Dublin. Why not come and explore and visit some of our other museum sites in Dublin and Mayo? We hope to see you soon.